I'm super excited to welcome Connor for our next presentation. And Connor is going to be talking about how to scale DAOs faster with Collective R&D. So Connor, welcome on stage, and I'll let you present.
Thanks, Kartik. Much appreciated. All right, I'll get this screen share going. Okay, great. So I assume everyone's looking at the right thing here, and that'll be pinged if not. Okay, awesome. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks, Kartik, for that nice introduction, and thanks to all the panelists who were right before me. That was fantastic. So if you're here today, I assume you're either participating in a DAO, or you want to start a DAO, or you want to start working for a DAO, which is really great because there is a ton of stuff to be doing. So I'm glad you're all here. I'm going to discuss today how we can come together as a community to help accelerate the pace at which DAOs can scale. So what I'm going to discuss first is the opportunities and logistics around open sourcing relevant DAO research. And then I'm going to dive into the biggest challenges for DAOs. And these are going to be non-technical challenges. I'm sure there are also a ton of technical challenges, and discuss some of the research that we're doing and other folks are doing to try and overcome some of those challenges. So hopefully in the next 25 minutes, I can help you understand, one, how to better accelerate the pace of development of your DAO, and two, help the whole community. Three, if you're not already working for a DAO, maybe I can help you plug in by giving some tips about things you should start looking into, because there's a lot that DAOs are going to need. So diving into it, what is the problem with DAO scaling? So as I'm sure many of you experience, there's a lack of operational clarity when it comes to the development of DAOs, and that really slows down the industry as a whole and DAOs specifically. As you, of course, know, DAOs are cutting edge organizational structures. So there's not a lot of precedent that operators and founders can look to when they're spinning up a DAO. They have to shoot from the hip a lot. There is some precedent, which I'll dive into, but obviously these are pretty novel structures. These organizations, DAOs, of course, are now starting to research more things like legal, like governance, diversity, treasury management, taxation, a lot of very key issues to the future of the DAOs, but much of that foundational learning and research is currently being siloed within those communities. We believe the best way to accelerate the development of DAOs and their functionality is for DAOs and those who are working for them to share that foundational knowledge at a really early stage and help the whole industry reach greater heights more quickly. So let's jump into a bit of an easy example. So say, for example, Uniswap, Compound, Maker, Curve, any number of DAOs want to come together because, or maybe you start with, they all have the same problem. The problem is that they want to know how to hire contractors legally. And I don't know how these entities are organized, but a lot of DAOs don't have structures or formal entities tied to them. So it's very difficult for them to figure out, okay, how do we actually pay a worker or sign a contract? For many of these DAOs, the initial problems they're dealing with are going to be the same. They're very novel issues, but they're also issues that other DAOs are having. So at an early stage, it makes much more sense for that research to come from a single source, vetted potentially by several professionals, researchers, et cetera. But a single source rather than having those DAOs go to, say, 5 different law firms and paying those 5 law firms to draft a memo on different entity structures or different ways in which contractors could be hired by an unassociated organization. This would decrease, obviously, the cost of that research substantially. And there's obviously the cost in dollar value, but there's also the cost in time, because time is very precious to DAO founders or operators, as I'm sure you know. There seem to be very few folks in the world really who can help run these organizations. And so the core team often ends up being responsible for a lot of work, and they, I'm sure, would much rather not have to deal with these lawyers. So diving more deeply, the problems broadly. Think about the research, the things that you should be researching, right? Now I'm going to go into those issues I think that would be really valuable for DAOs to know more about, and potentially for you to dive into and start maybe establishing your brand if you're not already in the DAO world. In order to figure out those problems, the most pressing for DAOs, we gathered together a lot of the leaders, like from leading operators to founders to investors, at an event called the DAOs Summit in June, which we hosted with Bankless and the EF and Stanford as well. And we also separately interviewed more than 20 other brilliant DAO stakeholders, asking all of them, what it was that they needed most. And we came up with a list of the 5 most pressing issues as described by them for DAOs. Now, at the DAO Research at the DAO Research Collective, we're taking it a step further in that we are not just getting in touch with the DAOs and bringing them together on a one-off basis, but we're raising capital as an organization specifically for purposes of identifying the biggest challenges and then funding and open sourcing rather R&D that responds to those most pressing issues. We're supported right now by the grants programs of Aave, Compound, and Uniswap, as well as the Ethereum Foundation. Now, for anyone listening here today who is themselves representing a large DAO, we would really encourage you to think about sharing as much knowledge and best practices as you can with the crypto community so we can all just keep growing and improving together. For those of you who are free agents, who are working potentially with a number of different DAOs, or who are simply looking to figure out how to best start with DAOs, we really encourage you to think about how much of a greater impact you could have if you open sourced your work. And in so doing, in a way, we're working for many DAOs. And so you could ask yourself, how can I open source my work and still get paid? Which is an important question. The obvious answer is that you could, if you're already doing work for DAOs, it could be, depending on your agreement with that DAO, available for you to open source to the community more broadly upon completion. But there are also groups like ours, the DAO Research Collective. This is where we come in. We're built specifically to fund and open source crypto research related to DAOs. And if we're not the right fit for you, there are a ton of other great organizations that are doing the same thing. Maybe not all DAO specific or with our specific focus, but you can think of organizations like Gitcoin, the Smart Contract Research Forum, of course, the Ethereum Foundation, grants programs through Compound, Uniswap, Aave, etc. A lot of different places you can go to start your research. So diving into the biggest issues for DAOs. The first one, the top most pressing issue, which we heard over and over again, is how do DAOs obtain legal clarity for themselves? So this was almost unanimously described to us as the most important issue. And it may not be too surprising because of how much FUD is in the space, especially recently, particularly given what we're hearing from the SEC and others. There are many specific legal questions which lawyers might address, but then there are really broader, outstanding legal queries related to things like operations, treasury management, taxation, and other areas that do require new policy or new regulation. And so in thinking about that as a founder, right? When you go to a lawyer, what the lawyer does is look to existing policy or existing regulation or existing case law. Like when a case is decided, the lawyer can look to that case to say, okay, this is how the regulator is going to treat this particular circumstance. If there isn't any policy or regulation or case law, then there's not very much that lawyers can do for you other than speculate pretty wildly. And sometimes they'll take your money to do that, but it's not always the best course of action or use of your money. The other piece, right, is advocating for better policy so that policymakers, politicians, and regulators make it more clear as to what it is that you can and can't do, and help to relieve some of the FUD that currently exists in the crypto industry. Now, given this is the most significant issue for DAOs among all the issues that we found, I'm going to spend a little bit more time here, and I'm going to give everyone a kind of PSA about the importance of advocacy, because it's something that a lot of folks aren't familiar with. You may have heard a little bit about it from Coin Center or from Ryan Selkis or from the guys at Bankless, but the stakes are truly very high. And this is only going to be something that we can really tackle effectively if we work together as a community. So when looking at the problem, smart contracts may be unstoppable, but the crypto industry is not. Government blessing has been crucial to every 20th century information empire to date. So just letting those two ideas sink in, right? While governments have no master keys that can shut crypto down, they can make it so expensive and so high risk for users to interact with crypto that the vast majority of their populations and all of their institutions will simply abandon use of crypto. This is particularly true in countries like the US, where the government has a very robust enforcement arm. The implications of anti-crypto policy would be much, much worse than your portfolio going through the floor. It could really threaten the existence of the industry that we've been creating over several years. Now, really important here not to let the fact that there's been very limited government intervention to date lull you into a false sense of security rather. Good actors in general in the crypto industry have had a great run with negligible antagonistic regulation from Western governments, but that appears to really be changing very quickly under the new US administration, which is very hostile to crypto. Western governments generally are accelerating the pace of regulating crypto. Recent examples include, as I'm sure you were made aware of recently, the expansion of the definition of broker in the infrastructure bill, which I believe is being voted on today in Congress, or potentially already has been. The ratcheting up of enforcement efforts by US regulatory agencies targeting the crypto industry. We all heard recently about how someone was subpoenaed at Masari's mainnet event. So that's the kind of tactics we're seeing employed at the moment. And the development of things like the markets in crypto assets, which is the MiCA proposal in the European Union around regulating crypto assets. Regulation is not in and of itself a problem. Governments do play a really important role in supporting and overseeing industry, but antagonistic regulations will slow the development of this industry, or much worse, it could just absolutely cripple it. On the other side, clear and reasonable regulations will significantly reduce FUD and allow for much more innovation. The industry truly is at an inflection point right now, can go really one of two extreme ways. These developments are very important in light of the new regulation we're seeing in influential jurisdictions, as mentioned, like the US and the EU. Because when something like this comes down from the US or the EU, it ends up being very influential to other jurisdictions that are just sort of around those two jurisdictions. So if you think you're safe because you're in a jurisdiction that currently isn't actively pursuing crypto companies, or because you could simply move to the Cayman Islands or some other tax haven, think again. The substantial regulation and enforcement in the West will most certainly impact your business and your legal expenses in trying to figure out how you stay out of the United States, but it's also really going to impact the size and the trajectory of the entire crypto industry. There is hope for the industry, but in order for us to see that hope realized, we need to take collective action. So by way of example, like what are we doing about this at the DAO Research Collective? We have written a guide for crypto companies on why they should help with advocacy and how they can help with advocacy. So they can look at it and they can easily plug in to what makes the most sense for them to contribute to really an initiative that's going to support the entire industry. Because knowing how to navigate Washington, for instance, is not something that the average dev knows or is interested in knowing, and that's totally fine. But we should know as an industry what we have to do to make sure that we're successful and that we can work with government to improve the current state of our regulatory environment. So we're going to be releasing this guide as a 3-part series with the Defiant. So we hope you all check it out and just start contributing, start fighting for crypto's future in the United States and really the Western world. The second issue is much more practical. So what are the best practices for DAOs to maintain legally compliant relationships with the individuals and the organizations that work for them? So DAO operators, and I'm sure many of you know this, face this issue daily as the organizations that try to enter into novel relationships with talent that don't necessarily have any legal precedent. Once again, if you have no entity, then it's very difficult to do things like enter into a contractual relationship with employees or contractors. And all of this is made much more difficult because typically you know where the organization is domiciled, which informs in some respect what laws you have to be compliant with. But in the case of DAOs, that's not totally clear, particularly where they have no entity. And it's also not totally clear what they do, given that many of their employees or workers or talent or whatever you want to call them live in many other jurisdictions. So that adds like a big new complicating factor to the situation. Another more niche or more narrow, I should say, legal topic is what are best practices for limiting the liability of DAO stakeholders, including founders, workers, and token holders. And just to clarify, with one, the issue is really broadly, how do we make this space more allow for more regulatory clarity in the space? Number 2 and 3 are more narrow questions related to that, but these are these questions where I think that we can get some insight from lawyers on. So with respect to the best practices for limiting liability, potential liability of DAO stakeholders was really unsurprisingly top of mind for many of the people that we interviewed, and based on what we saw at the DAO research or the DAO virtual summit. Crypto teams generally do have a high risk tolerance, as I'm sure many of you are aware, but given the breadth of legal uncertainty around DAOs, they seem particularly eager to figure out how they can limit their personal liability. One of the most obvious and direct paths to limiting liability is to incorporate legal entities. Which type of entity and the scope of that entity's work are very much open questions, but most teams that have actually started legal entities hope to dissolve them eventually anyways, once it's more clear from a legal perspective that they can do that. And so with respect to this section, this is kind of something that a lot of teams are reticent to do with good reason. Some people think that it kind of speaks against the transparency that so many of us value in crypto, but I can tell you that's not always the case. There are some particularly novel, unique, and alternative entity structures that could be pretty effectively integrated into different DAO structures. They might not work for every DAO, but they might work for some. Another way of limiting liability for your DAO, and this is something I'm starting to see some DAOs implement, is to form a mutual or an indemnity fund that protects organizations and their talent from the cost of legal action. So thinking about this practically, if you have a DAO and you want to protect your workers, I mean, if you were a corporation, you might be able to indemnify those workers directly. And if they get sued for work done for you, you might be able to cover them. In this case, what you might be able to do is form a fund. This could be a separate entity in your DAO, or it could be a fund that's formed between multiple DAOs to, in a way, ensure those workers so that if they are sued for work done on your behalf, they can be covered, at least to some extent. And one thing I should have noted at the top is none of this is legal advice. If you need legal advice, talk to a lawyer. None of it's investment advice, etc. I imagine they mentioned that at the very top, but just in case, always good to cover your bases on that front. We haven't seen that much on the front of how do you indemnify or insure DAO workers, but I think this is a really important subject matter. And so if any of you want to start a new business in the space that's going to have a lot of customers, think about how we can do insurance for DAOs. Now, in response to these two issues, to 2 and 3, these specific legal issues related to workers and liability, what we've done at the DAO Research Collective is we started to work with some of the leading law firms in the space and have them draft memos, for instance, on how DAOs can work effectively with contractors, how we should think about DAOs using entities or not, how DAOs can limit liability, how DAOs can pay taxes. So there are some areas in which we hope to be able to provide some clarity, though we appreciate to get that ultimate clarity, we do need to be working with policymakers and regulators. Moving on to the next topic. How do you develop an equitable, scalable, and decentralized governance system for DAOs? So in this case, interviewees really were wrestling with how to use mechanisms like proposals, elections, delegations, and delegation rather, and voting thresholds to create ideal governance systems. Many DAOs simply mimic the system of their higher signal predecessors rather, without assessing whether that strategy is optimal for their specific project. And so you can think of easy examples here, right? Like Uniswap and Compound come out and they are incredibly successful, and folks think, okay, I'll just do what they did, without thinking about the specifics that went into decisions made by Uniswap or Compound, or whether that would really be appropriate at all for the project that that DAO is running. But really, big question is still, how do you develop a system that's both scalable and decentralized? Many of our interviewees observed that a DAO could scale much more easily if it's centralized, at least to some extent, and wrapped itself in a legal entity, or simply used a legal entity for some of its operations. Now, this system might be flawed. Some legal entities were designed, however, at least in part, to more efficiently coordinate decision-making between different people with a shared financial interest. So they were designed in part to fulfill some of the needs of DAOs, though they certainly didn't contemplate the sort of technical innovation that allows for DAOs to be as amazing as they are. Interviewees, which we spoke with, suggested that they wanted to extract those good parts from legacy systems while omitting the bad parts. By way of simple example of this, most larger DAOs have done things like create work streams or committees and delegated decision-making to some of the groups at lower levels. So like they'll have a treasury management committee or guild, they'll have a marketing committee, a grants program, there are, like, if you want to see this in action, just jump into the Discord of any DAO. Bankless, I think, does a really good job of this, where you have guilds performing different functions. And you can also see hierarchy, where folks who have been contributing for a long time seem to be given different permissions in the Discord channel. And I'm sure in the back end, they're kind of receiving different compensation, et cetera, for their contributions. We're seeing these organizations form in a similar way to the way that we're seeing corporations and other more centralized types of organizations delegate authority. Equitable DAO governance is another very important consideration here that needs to not be overlooked, and it usually is at this stage. We're making decisions today about systems that could be precedents for how DAOs look going forward. And if we bake in norms that are going to discriminate against certain types of people, or that are going to effectively centralize power to a very small group of decision makers and whales, we may very well fall into some of the same traps as legacy corporate structures and Web 2.0. And I mean, this, like so many things, is very hard to keep in touch with this issue at times, because everyone's scrambling, everyone's building the plane while they're flying it, et cetera, et cetera. But this is really core to the success of DAOs in the long term, is not being burdened, right, by the same traps of those legacy corporations, not establishing themselves to be inequitable institutions. A few interviewees we spoke with also made the point that DAOs could benefit substantially from looking to past precedents when it came to things like governance systems, right? This isn't too surprising. This is an area with an extensive amount of scholarship that DAOs could apply when creating their systems. And I can tell you at the DAO Research Collective, we're working with a number of different folks, but easy example is an organizational psychologist. And organizational psychologists think about this very thing. How do you structure organizations to be most efficient, to have most impact, et cetera? And this is a field of research that has existed for a long time. The human condition hasn't changed so much, so substantially that their research is irrelevant. We can certainly apply it and think about what we need to do to organize DAOs and incentivize folks to work in the right way. The very final issue. So what are the best practices for hiring, onboarding, and managing talent at a DAO? Now, previously we just talked about a legal question about how do you hire contractors, but this is really a different question entirely. Beyond that legal question, there are also the practical questions regarding the best practices for onboarding, hiring, and managing a workforce. Given the novelty of DAOs, it's difficult to find and really vet people to know whether they're going to be well suited for DAOs. Not many of them have worked for DAOs before. And working for a DAO is a very self-directed and nebulous thing at times, right? Everyone's sort of a builder and has to be responsible for themselves, or it doesn't work too well, at least at this stage. Once hired, DAO teams find it really time consuming to transfer knowledge to new workers. So DAO core teams often end up being responsible for the majority of their operations because they simply don't want to take the time to bring in anyone else. Given the transparency of DAOs, this seems a bit counterintuitive, but given the pace at which DAOs have evolved, these organizations do have a really hard time documenting internal operations, making it even harder to onboard new workers. And this is not an issue, of course, that's exclusive to DAOs. This is an issue that traditional corporations face forever. How many resources do you allocate to bringing on new people versus just doing the job yourself? But it's a bit of a novel circumstance, of course, with DAOs. Once folks are onboarded, DAO core teams have to decide how they're going to manage that talent, which can be quite tricky given how flat DAO structures typically are. But as I'm mentioning, we're seeing that evolve and different people take on different maybe levels of authority in the hierarchy of DAOs and take on different responsibilities and authorizations. That brings us to the very end of our challenges. So I hope that was informative and helpful. If you have any questions about those challenges or what we're looking to do to solve them, or about the DAO Research Collective generally, or DAOs generally, very happy to respond to those questions. My Twitter handle is here at @C_Spelliscy. I don't know, I'm not really sure if we have a minute now, but if not, or if you don't remember a question, just feel free to ping me on Twitter.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Connor. I think this is an incredible presentation. We're already seeing a pretty engaging chat on the live stream about people just kind of walking through other models that they've explored.
Awesome.
Maybe there's one request. The request is if you can share these slides later on, you can send it to us over email or here. We'll post that link for everybody to look at. The other kind of question or the discussion that's happening is what are some of your thoughts on the downsides of the Wyoming DAO model and sort of how do you think about what's happening jurisdictionally in different places? So, and you covered some of these things directly or indirectly in your talk, but how do you think about a decision-making framework as people are choosing how to tie a legal entity to their operations?
Yeah, I mean, the Wyoming bill is interesting, and it seems like, in my mind, it's a good start. It's a good approach to start and think critically about what we need to change to make DAOs, useful or make legal structures useful for DAOs. But I just haven't candidly seen too much traction. I haven't seen too many folks who are actually excited about organizing their DAOs using that structure. What we're seeing more of, I think Aaron Wright's done some great writing on this, on the idea of using or different kinds of organizational structures like unincorporated nonprofits. There's some promise there as organizations that might be able to both exist within the philosophy of crypto from a decentralized and transparent perspective, but may also be able to do things that are going to be really important, like pay taxes, right? Which is not necessarily enabled at the moment with DAOs. So we're going to see some writing on that, and we've actually supported some writing from the taxation perspective. We're also supporting writing from one of the leading firms in Colorado, and Colorado is the Delaware of, Delaware is like the place to go, right, for corporate if you're going to incorporate. But if you're going to do a cooperative, you go to Colorado. They have the best precedent, best case law there. And so we're working with a firm that spent a lot of their time looking into cooperatives. And this is something, if folks are interested in this, I wrote a paper with Jesse Walden a little while ago on applying really the principles from cooperatives when scaling your crypto company. And I think it applies to DAOs as well. But we want to go so much deeper into that and work with professionals whose career it's been, so they can think critically about, okay, how can we use the cooperative structure, which has things like, members and doesn't have shareholders in the same way we would think about a traditional corporation, and apply that knowledge, pull from that precedent. So like, that's a really long answer, but in short, more stuff coming soon on this. I don't think that there's a perfect structure yet, but maybe as an interesting thought exercise, look at what Flamingo DAO is doing. They have very clear documentation on what they're up to, and I think that Aaron Wright's part of that as well. Yeah. And I think it's like a kind of a cool way to start exploring structures in DAO.
Awesome. Well, thanks for that. And if you have any other questions for Connor, you can ask them on the chat or ping him and follow him on Twitter. So thanks again, Connor, and we are ready to move on to our next discussion.
Thanks, Kartik. Thanks all.